2 million people stand on the gleaming white platform every year, believing they are visiting a monument to the past, but they are actually hovering over an active environmental disaster. 40 feet beneath the calm surface of Pearl Harbor, the steel bones of 1941 are finally beginning to fail in ways that no engineer could have predicted 8 decades ago. The ship is not resting in peace. It is slowly bleeding to death, and the time to save the grave is running out. For the tourists who line up at the visitor center, the experience is somber but sanitized. They watch a film, they board a Navy shuttle boat, and they step onto the white concrete structure that straddles the sunken hull of the USS Arizona. The air is usually warm, smelling of salt and tropical flowers. The American flag snaps in the trade winds. It feels permanent, a solid tribute to the 1,177 men who lost their lives on a Sunday morning in December. But if you look over the railing, the illusion of permanence begins to dissolve. The water of the harbor is not clear blue. It is dark and murky. And rising from the darkness, drop by drop, is a substance that creates a rainbow sheen on the surface. These are the black tears of the Arizona. It is heavy fuel oil, bunker C, the lifeblood of a battleship that has been dead for 84 years. The oil is a visceral reminder that the history here is not finished. It smells of the engine room. It stains the white concrete of the memorial if the wind blows the wrong way. For decades, the National Park Service and the Navy have monitored these leaks, estimating that the ship still holds hundreds of thousands of gallons of fuel in her corroded bunkers. The oil escapes at a rate of 2 to 9 quarts a day, a slow, rhythmic pulse that suggests the ship is still, in some haunting way, alive. However, in the early months of 2025, the slow decay of the Arizona suddenly accelerated into an acute crisis. The problem was not the oil itself, nor was it the tourists walking overhead. The threat came from the harbor infrastructure that had stood silent sentinel alongside the battleship since the war began. Navy divers and National Park Service submersibles conducting routine structural surveys noticed a terrifying development. The focus of their concern was a series of massive concrete structures known as mooring quays, specifically Quay S6 and Quay S7. These were not part of the ship. They were the concrete islands built into the harbor floor where the Arizona was tied up on the morning of the attack. They are massive, heavy blocks of concrete and steel designed to hold a 30,000-ton warship against the wind. But concrete, like steel, has a lifespan. The salt water had been eating away at the reinforcing rebar inside the quays for nearly a century. The inspections revealed that the concrete was spalling, cracking, and flaking off in large chunks. The structural integrity of the mooring platforms was failing. The implications were catastrophic. These concrete monoliths, weighing more than 100 tons, loomed directly over the submerged deck of the battleship. If they were to collapse, they would not fall harmlessly into the mud. They would fall onto the Arizona. The hull of the battleship, weakened by 8 decades of saltwater corrosion, is now as fragile as eggshell in places. A collapse of the mooring quay would be like dropping a boulder onto a glass table. The impact would punch through the teak decking and the steel plating below. It would smash into the compartments that have been sealed since 1941. This was not just a matter of damaging a historical artifact. The USS Arizona is a designated war grave. More than 900 men are still entombed inside the hull. Their remains lie in the mud-filled compartments, undisturbed, protected by the sanctity of the site and the physical barrier of the steel. A structural collapse would violate that grave. It would crush the spaces where the crew rests. Furthermore, a collapse could rupture the remaining fuel bunkers. If the structural shockwave cracked the oil tanks, the slow trickle of black tears could turn into a massive geyser of sludge, coating the harbor in toxic fuel and creating an environmental disaster in one of the most sensitive historic sites in the world. The situation required an immediate emergency intervention. The Department of Defense and the Department of the Interior faced a dilemma. They had to remove the crumbling concrete quays to save the ship, but the operation itself risked destroying the vessel. They had to bring heavy equipment, cranes, and barges into the sanctuary of the memorial, operating inches above the fragile hull without ever touching it. The plan developed was a feat of surgical engineering. The Navy mobilized its mobile diving and salvage units. They brought in floating cranes capable of lifting tons of concrete with millimeter precision. The operation had to be conducted with the delicacy of a bomb disposal squad. Divers went into the water. The visibility in Pearl Harbor is notoriously poor, often less than 5 feet. The divers had to work by touch and by the dim light of their lamps, navigating around the jagged metal of the wreck and the crumbling face of the concrete quays. They used underwater cutting tools to slice through the sediment and the connections that held the quays to the harbor floor. The tension during the lift was palpable. As the cranes took the strain of the concrete blocks, the engineers monitored the sensors placed on the battleship's hull. Any slip, any sudden shift in the load could send the concrete crashing down. The margin for error was 0. The Arizona could not withstand a blow. Slowly, section by section, the threat was removed. The crumbling concrete was hoisted out of the water and placed on barges to be hauled away. The shadow that had loomed over the hull was gone. The immediate danger of a crush injury to the grave was averted. But as the divers surfaced and the cranes moved away, the reality of the situation settled in. The removal of the quays was a victory, but it was a temporary one. It was a band-aid on a terminal patient. The operation had saved the Arizona from being crushed from the outside, but it could do nothing to stop the ship from collapsing from the inside. The steel of the hull is dissolving. Every year, the metal gets thinner. The corrosion is a chemical fire that burns underwater, consuming the iron and returning it to the earth. The rivets that hold the plates together are failing. The teak deck, which once felt the boots of admirals and sailors, is being eaten by marine organisms. The 2025 intervention highlighted a profound paradox that defines the USS Arizona Memorial. We are trying to preserve something that is destined to disappear. We are fighting a war against entropy to protect a memory. The ship is dying. In fact, she has been dying for 84 years, ever since the fires were extinguished in December 1941. The oil that continues to leak is a reminder of the ship's former power. In 1941, the Arizona was a fortress. She carried 1.5 million gallons of fuel oil to feed her massive boilers. She was designed to project American power across the Pacific. Now, that fuel is a liability, a toxic legacy that threatens the ecosystem of the harbor. Scientists have spent years studying the oil. They have analyzed samples of the black tears. The chemical signature confirms that it is indeed bunker C fuel oil, refined in the late 1930s or early 1940s. It is time capsule fuel trapped in the labyrinth of the ship's bunkers. The rate of the leakage varies. Some days it is a few drops. Other days it is a steady stream. It depends on the tide, the temperature of the water, and the subtle shifts in the hull's structure. When the metal expands in the summer heat, the cracks widen and the oil flows faster. When the water cools, the metal contracts and the flow slows. The ship breathes. For the families of the men who died, and for the few remaining survivors who have chosen to be interred on the ship, the Arizona is sacred ground. It is not a shipwreck, it is a cathedral. The thought of it collapsing, of the walls falling in and the roof coming down, is painful. It feels like a second death for the men inside, but the Navy and the Park Service are forced to be pragmatists. They use lasers and sonar to map the changes in the hull. They have installed sensors to measure the stress on the metal. They know the data. They know that gravity will eventually win. The deck will collapse. The sides will fold in. The Arizona will become a pile of unrecognizable debris on the harbor floor. The emergency work in 2025 bought time. It ensured that the collapse would not happen today and hopefully not tomorrow. It allowed the tours to continue. It allowed the flag to keep flying. It allowed the veterans to come back one more time to pay their respects. As the sun sets over the Waianae Range, casting long shadows across the harbor, the white memorial glows in the twilight. Beneath it, the darkness of the water seems to deepen. The Arizona is silent, save for the slow release of oil bubbles rising to the surface. She has survived Japanese bombs. She has survived 8 decades of salt. She has survived the weight of history. But she is tired. The removal of the concrete quays was an act of mercy, lightening the load on a weary spirit. It was a reminder that even symbols of eternal resolve are made of temporary materials. To understand why this ship is worth such effort, why we spend millions of dollars to move concrete blocks and map corrosion, we must look back. We must strip away the rust and the oil. We must peel back the decades and see the Arizona not as a tomb, but as a weapon. We must go back to the time when she was whole, when her decks were scrubbed white, and when her crew believed they were serving on the most powerful ship in the Pacific. We must go back to the moment before the oil started to bleed. To understand the magnitude of the loss, one must first strip away the rust and the silence of the modern memorial. Before the USS Arizona was a tomb, she was a titan. In the hierarchy of the United States Navy in 1941, she was royalty, a Pennsylvania-class super dreadnought that represented the absolute zenith of American industrial power. She was 608 feet long, displacing nearly 30,000 tons of hardened steel. She was not a relic, she was a modernized, lethal instrument of war, armed with 12 14-inch guns capable of hurling a 1,400-pound shell over 20 miles. When she lay at berth F7 along Battleship Row, she was a floating city. She housed more than 1,700 men, a population larger than many of the small towns from which her sailors hailed. She had her own bakery, her own post office, her own dentist, and her own baseball team. To the men who served on her, she felt invincible. She was built to shrug off enemy fire, armored with belts of steel 13 inches thick. The idea that she could be destroyed in a matter of seconds was not just terrifying, it was technically inconceivable. On the evening of Saturday, December 6, 1941, the Arizona was at rest. The atmosphere on board was defined by the relaxed routine of a peacetime weekend. The ship had recently returned from training maneuvers, and the crew was looking forward to a Sunday of leisure. Supply barges had delivered fresh provisions, crates of oranges, sides of beef, and sacks of flour for the Sunday morning pancakes. The primary topic of conversation among the crew was not the geopolitical tension in the Pacific, but a musical competition. The USS Arizona possessed one of the finest bands in the fleet. The 21 members of the ship's band, known as Unit N, had practiced for weeks. They had qualified for the finals of the Battle of the Music competition, scheduled to be held ashore on Sunday afternoon. Their instruments were polished, their uniforms were pressed, and their morale was high. They believed they were going to win the trophy. Liberty passes were issued. Sailors took water taxis to Honolulu to buy Christmas gifts or watch a movie. Those who stayed aboard wrote letters home, played cards in the mess decks, or slept on cots set up on the open deck to catch the cooling trade winds. There was no sense of impending doom. The ship was not at general quarters. The watertight doors were open to allow air circulation. The ammunition-ready boxes for the anti-aircraft guns were locked. The Arizona was a giant sleeping with its eyes closed. The sun rose on December 7th at 6:26 a.m. It was a brilliant, clear morning. The harbor was calm. On the fantail of the Arizona, the crew was erecting the awning for church services. The band members were finishing their breakfast, preparing to assemble on deck to play the national anthem for the 8:00 a.m. flag raising. At 7:55 a.m., the air raid sirens on Ford Island began to wail. At first, many men on the Arizona assumed it was a drill, perhaps an unannounced inspection by a zealous admiral. But then they saw the planes. They were low, fast, and marked with the red disk of the Imperial Japanese Navy. They were not flying in formation, they were swarming. The sound of radial engines screaming at full throttle shattered the Sunday quiet. The transition from peace to war was instantaneous. The alarm gongs aboard the Arizona began to clang. General quarters. Men dropped their coffee cups and sprinted for their battle stations. They moved through a ship that was suddenly waking up to a nightmare. The watertight doors had to be closed. The ammunition hoists had to be activated. The guns had to be manned. At 8:00 a.m., as the color guard was hoisting the ensign on the stern, the first wave of Japanese attackers focused on the battleships. The Arizona was moored inboard of the repair ship USS Vestal, a position that protected her port side from torpedoes but left her decks exposed to the sky. At approximately 8:06 a.m., the Arizona took her first hit. A bomb dropped by a high-altitude bomber struck the aft section of the ship near turret number 4. It glanced off the face of the turret and penetrated the deck, detonating in the pantry area. The explosion was violent. It started a fire and threw men across the compartment. It destroyed the ship's galley and killed several members of the damage control team. But it was a survivable wound. The Arizona was a battleship. She was designed to take hits. The armor held the vitals safe. The crew, though shaken, continued to fight. The anti-aircraft batteries opened fire. The damage control parties dragged hoses toward the smoke. The captain, Franklin van Valkenburg, reached the bridge. Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd, whose flag was flying on the Arizona, joined him. They stood on the navigation bridge, exposed and calm, directing the defense of the ship. They believed they were in for a long, grueling fight. They had 4 minutes left to live. High above the harbor, a flight of Nakajima B-5N Kate bombers was lining up its run. These were not carrying ordinary gravity bombs. They were carrying a specialized weapon developed specifically for this attack, the Type 99 No. 80 Mark V bomb. It was essentially a 16-inch naval armor-piercing shell that had been converted into an aerial bomb. It weighed nearly 1,800 pounds. It was designed to do one thing: punch through heavy deck armor before detonating deep inside a ship. At 8:10 a.m., the lead plane released its payload. The bomb fell for several seconds, accelerating to terminal velocity. It struck the Arizona near turret number 2, forward of the bridge. The physics of the impact were catastrophic. The bomb did not explode on contact. Its hardened steel nose smashed through the teak deck. It punched through the first layer of steel. It continued down, smashing through the second deck and then the third. It came to rest inside the forward black powder magazine. This compartment was the heart of the ship's firepower. It stored the black powder used for the aircraft catapults and the ignition charges for the main guns. But adjacent to it was the main magazine, filled with smokeless powder bags for the 14-inch rifles. When the bomb detonated, it triggered a chain reaction that defies comprehension. Within a fraction of a second, the black powder ignited. The flash expanded instantly, tearing through the bulkheads and igniting the main magazine. More than 1 million pounds of explosive propellant detonated simultaneously. The result was not a fire, it was a volcanic eruption. The forward half of the USS Arizona simply disintegrated. The force of the explosion was so immense that it lifted the 30,000-ton battleship out of the water. The structural spine of the ship, the keel, snapped. The forward turrets, weighing hundreds of tons each, were thrown into the air like toys. Turret number 1 dropped 20 feet. Turret number 2 collapsed forward. A fireball rose 500 feet into the air, turning the harbor sky red. It consumed the oxygen in the area instantly. The blast wave flattened everything in its path. It blew the repair ship Vestal, moored alongside, clear off the side of the battleship, sweeping her decks clean of men, including her captain, Cassin Young, who was blown into the water and swam back to his ship to continue the fight. On the Arizona, the devastation was absolute. The bridge where Admiral Kidd and Captain van Valkenburg stood was incinerated. They were never found. The forward barracks spies, where hundreds of men were sleeping or preparing for duty, were crushed and burned in the same instant. The entire ship's band, Unit N, had been up on the fantail or moving toward their battle stations near the turrets. Every single member of the band was killed. The music they had practiced for weeks was silenced forever. The explosion lasted only a few seconds, but the destruction was total. The ship settled back into the mud, a broken, burning ruin. The superstructure was twisted into a skeletal nightmare of melted steel. The foremast collapsed forward. The decks were a charnel house of fire and oil. For the men in the aft section of the ship, the experience was one of utter disorientation. One moment they were fighting a fire. The next, the front of their world was gone. The shockwave threw them against bulkheads. The lights died. The air filled with thick, black smoke from the burning fuel oil. Of the 1,512 men on board that morning, 1,177 were killed. The vast majority of them died in the split second of the magazine explosion. They never knew what hit them. One moment they were sailors on the mightiest ship in the Pacific, the next they were history. The fires on the Arizona burned for 2.5 days. The fuel oil bunkers had been ruptured, feeding the flames that licked at the sky. The harbor water around the wreck turned into a burning lake of sludge. Rescue crews from nearby ships tried to approach, but the heat was intense enough to blister paint 50 yards away. They pulled survivors from the water, men covered in oil, burned and dazed, but there were few to find. The magnitude of the loss on the Arizona accounted for nearly half of all American fatalities at Pearl Harbor. It was a wound so deep that it shocked the nation into a total mobilization. But as the fires finally died down and the smoke cleared, the Navy faced a grim realization. Other battleships, the West Virginia, the California, the Oklahoma, had been sunk, but they looked salvageable. They were resting on the bottom, damaged but intact. The Arizona was different. She was not just sunk, she was destroyed. Her back was broken. Her interior was a fused mass of steel and ash. She was no longer a warship. She was a tomb. The engineers who surveyed the wreck in the days following the attack came to a quiet conclusion. There was no point in raising her. There was nothing to repair. And more importantly, the cost of removing the hundreds of bodies trapped in the twisted metal of the forward hull would be a gruesome, nearly impossible task. So, a decision began to form in the minds of the Naval Command. A decision that would shape the future of the site for the next century. They would strip the guns. They would cut away the superstructure. But the hull and the men inside it would stay where they fell. The Arizona would not return to the fight. She would remain on duty in Pearl Harbor, a silent witness to the 9 minutes that changed the world. In the grim calculus of 1942, the United States Navy did not have the luxury of sentimentality. The Pacific Fleet had been crippled, and the war machine needed every ounce of steel, copper, and firepower it could scavenge from the mud of Pearl Harbor. One by one, the sunken giants were resurrected. The USS West Virginia, despite taking 9 torpedo hits, was pumped out, patched, and sent to the West Coast for repair. She would return to the war to smash Japanese battleships at Surigao Strait. The USS California was raised. Even the USS Oklahoma, which had capsized completely, was righted in a massive engineering feat, though she would later sink while being towed to the mainland. But when the salvage divers descended into the murky water surrounding berth F7, they found a different reality. They were not looking at a damaged ship, they were looking at a shattered spine. The surveys conducted in early 1942 revealed the extent of the violence. The explosion of the forward magazine had not just blown the bow apart, it had broken the ship's back. The keel, the massive structural backbone of the vessel, was snapped. The forward section had telescoped into the mud, widening the hull by feet. The interior decks had collapsed into a chaotic sandwich of twisted steel and ash. The engineers did the math. To raise the Arizona, they would essentially have to build a cofferdam around the entire wreck, pump out the ocean, and then cut the ship into pieces to move her. It would require thousands of man-hours and millions of dollars. And unlike the West Virginia, there was no ship left to save. The Arizona would never sail again. She was scrap metal. Then there was the matter of the crew. Navy divers working in the pitch black of the oil-slicked interior reported a horror that no salvage plan could easily address. The blast and the subsequent fire had incinerated many men instantly, but hundreds more were trapped deep in the lower compartments. The conditions inside the wreck were horrific. The water was a toxic soup of fuel oil, decomposition, and debris. To recover the bodies would require dismantling the ship compartment by compartment, a gruesome task that would expose the salvage crews to unimaginable psychological trauma. A quiet, solemn decision began to take shape within the Department of the Navy. It was a decision born of necessity, but it evolved into an act of reverence. They would strip the ship of her war-making utility, but they would leave the hull and the men inside undisturbed. Throughout 1942 and 1943, the Arizona was slowly demilitarized. The main battery turrets were examined. Turrets 3 and 4, located in the aft section, were largely intact. They were removed along with their massive 14-inch guns and installed as coastal defense batteries on the island of Oahu, pointed out to sea to defend against a Japanese invasion that never came. The superstructure was cut away down to the waterline to clear the field of fire for other ships. The foremast was removed. By the end of the war, the Arizona had vanished from the skyline. She was a submerged reef of rusted iron, visible only from the air or by the slick of oil that continued to bleed from her wounds. She was no longer a commissioned warship, she was a designated tomb. In the decades that followed, the legal and ethical status of the wreck solidified. The Navy transferred the administration of the site to the National Park Service, though it retained ownership of the vessel. The passing of the Sunken Military Craft Act codified the protection. The ship was sovereign territory. a war grave that could not be disturbed by treasure hunters or unauthorized divers. But while the laws of man declared the site protected, the laws of chemistry declared it a target. The Arizona is rusting. This is an inevitability of iron in salt water. But the specific way the Arizona is decaying is a subject of intense scientific study. The ship is undergoing a process of concretion. Marine organisms, corals, barnacles, tube worms, have attached themselves to the steel. In some ways, this biofouling forms a protective hardshell, slowing the flow of oxygen to the metal. But underneath, the electrochemical reaction continues. The steel plating is thinning, the rivets are popping. The weight of the mud inside the ship is pressing outward while the weight of the water presses inward. This structural decay is directly linked to the phenomenon of the weeping ship. The oil that rises to the surface is not just residual sludge, it is a barometer of the hull's health. The Arizona carried roughly 1.5 million gallons of Bunker C fuel oil when she was attacked. A massive amount burned off in the fire, but estimates suggest that perhaps 500,000 gallons remain trapped in the deep bunkers. These bunkers are located in the lower decks, protected by the double bottom of the hull. As the corrosion eats through the bulkheads, new pathways open up. Oil that has been trapped in a sealed compartment for 80 years suddenly finds a crack. Being lighter than water, it migrates upward, seeping through the rotting teak deck, through the open hatches, and up to the surface. The black tears are beautiful in a tragic way, creating rainbows on the water that tourists photograph, but they are also a ticking environmental clock. If the hull were to collapse suddenly, a structural pancaking, it could release the remaining oil in a massive pulse. This creates an agonizing dilemma for the custodians of the wreck. In a normal situation, environmental protocols would demand that the oil be pumped out. But you cannot pump out the Arizona without drilling into the hull. You cannot drill into the hull without disturbing the grave. How do you weigh the sanctity of 900 sailors against the health of a coral reef? For now, the policy is non-intervention. The National Park Service and the Navy have chosen to manage the leak rather than stop it. They monitor the flow. They have spill response equipment ready, but they will not cut into the ship. The oil is considered part of the memorial, a visceral connection to the blood of the vessel. To understand the future of the wreck, scientists have deployed the most advanced technology available. They do not guess, they measure. They use finite element modeling, FEM, a computerized method used to predict how complex structures react to stress. They have built a digital avatar of the Arizona, simulating the thickness of every plate and the load of every deck. The data is sobering. The sensors indicate that the midships section, the area where the heavy armor belt is located, is slowly sagging. The ship is flattening out. The vertical bulkheads that hold the decks up are thinning. Eventually, they will buckle. The timeline for this collapse is debated. Some models suggest the ship has decades of stability left. Others warn of a cascading failure that could happen within a generation. The removal of the concrete mooring keys in 2025 was a reaction to this data, a realization that the ship is too fragile to support any external weight. This scientific reality forces a confrontation with the nature of memory. We build memorials out of stone and bronze because we want them to last forever. We want the memory of the dead to be permanent. But the USS Arizona is not stone. It is a machine made of perishable materials sitting in a corrosive bath. It is slowly returning to nature. The sharp lines of the gun tubs are softening under layers of coral. The teak deck is being consumed by wood-boring worms. The steel is becoming iron oxide. There is a school of thought among preservationists that this decay should be allowed to happen, that the disappearance of the ship is the final stage of its life cycle, that we should not try to pickle the Arizona in plastic or encase her in concrete. She fought, she died, and now she is returning to the earth. But for the families, the ship is not just a structure, it is a reliquary. It holds the physical remains of their ancestors. As long as the hull holds together, the crew is together. If the hull breaks open, the grave is violated. This is why the monitoring is so obsessive. Divers go down not to look at the past, but to forecast the future. They measure the oil droplets to see if the rate is increasing. They check the reference points on the hull to see if the metal has shifted by a fraction of an inch. They are doctors tending to a patient who can never be cured, only comforted. The decision made in 1942 to leave the men behind was a pragmatic one, born of war. But the decision to keep leaving them there, year after year, has become a moral vow. It is a promise that we will stand guard over the decay. We will watch the oil bleed until the last drop is gone. We will watch the steel dissolve until the last rivet fails. The Arizona is a war grave, but it is also a clock. It is counting down the time we have left to remember the event physically. One day the ship will be gone, the white memorial will stand over a patch of rust-stained sand. But until that day comes, the Navy and the Park Service fight a quiet, high-tech war against chemistry to keep the shape of the ship intact. It is a battle they will ultimately lose, but it is a battle they are honor-bound to fight. The ship rests in the silence of the harbor, a disintegrating fortress holding the line against oblivion. The story of the USS Arizona is usually told as a narrative of mass death, a singular event that extinguished 1,100 lives in a heartbeat. But in the quiet laboratories of the Defense POW and MIA Accounting Agency, DPAA, and on the sun-drenched deck of the memorial, a different story is being written. It is a story of retrieval, of return, and of a stubborn refusal to let the men of 1941 fade into anonymity. While the majority of the crew rests inside the hull, entombed by the decision of 1942, not everyone was left behind. In the chaotic aftermath of the attack, recovery teams pulled bodies from the water and the superstructure. Many were burned beyond recognition, stripped of their dog tags and their identities by the violence of the explosion. For decades, these men lay in graves marked simply unknown at the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific, in the volcanic crater known as the Punch Bowl. They were the lost fragment of the Arizona's crew, separated from their shipmates in death, denied their names by the limitations of 1940s forensic science. But science has caught up to history. In recent years, the military launched Operation 85, a crusade to restore names to these unknown sailors. It is a process that combines the cold precision of DNA sequencing with the emotional warmth of genealogy. Scientists exhume the caskets. They extract genetic material from bone fragments that have been buried for 80 years. They compare these markers against swabs taken from grandnieces, nephews, and distant cousins scattered across America. It is a slow, quiet miracle. One by one, the unknowns are becoming ensigns, seamen, and petty officers again. When a match is found, a name is restored. A family receives a phone call that closes a loop open for generations. These men are often reburied with full military honors, sometimes back in their hometowns, sometimes back at the Punch Bowl, but this time with their names carved in stone. This effort highlights a profound truth about the Arizona. The ship is not a static object. It is an active connection between the past and the present. It is a relationship. This relationship is most visibly demonstrated by a ritual that is unique in the world of military history. The USS Arizona is the only ship in the United States Navy that allows its survivors to return to the wreck after death. For the men who survived December 7, 1941, life was a long shadow, cast by the smoke of that morning. They went on to fight the rest of the war. They married, had children, built careers, and grew old, but a part of them never left the harbor. They carried the guilt of survival, the question of why me, and the memory of the friends they left in the fire. As these survivors approached the end of their natural lives, many made a choice that defies the instinct for self-preservation. They chose not to be buried in family plots or national cemeteries. They chose to go back to the ship. The interment ceremony is solemn and private. It takes place on the white concrete memorial, usually in the evening when the tourists have gone. A Navy diver takes a small, sealed urn containing the ashes of the survivor. He steps off the dock and sinks into the dark water. The diver swims down to the wreck. He navigates to the barbette of turret number 4, the massive circular steel structure that once supported the gunhouse. This is the designated point of entry, an open wound in the ship's armor that leads into the hull. The diver places the urn inside the ship amidst the silt and the darkness. He pauses, offers a final salute in the weightless silence, and ascends. With that act, the circle is closed. The survivor is reunited with his shipmates. The crew is reforming, one man at a time. Lou Conter, the last known survivor of the USS Arizona, passed away in April 2024 at the age of 102. With his passing, the living memory of the ship was extinguished. There are no more eyes left that saw the bomb fall. There are no more voices that can describe the sound of the explosion. The era of the survivor is over. We have entered the era of the artifact. This transition forces us to confront the inevitable physical future of the USS Arizona. The engineering interventions, the removal of the concrete quays, the monitoring of the oil leaks, these are holding actions. They are buying time, but they cannot buy eternity. The laws of chemistry are absolute. The steel of the Arizona is returning to the elements from which it was forged. The salt water is breaking the molecular bonds of the iron. The corrosion is relentless. Engineers predict a moment of structural flattening where the vertical integrity of the hull will fail. The decks will pancake down. The sides will blow out. The recognizable shape of the battleship will dissolve into a mound of rust and debris. When that happens, the oil leak will likely stop. The black tears will finally run dry. The physical presence of the ship will fade into the harbor floor, becoming indistinguishable from the coral and the mud. What happens to the memorial then? What happens when the tomb beneath your feet is no longer a ship, but just a stain in the sediment? The answer lies in the difference between a grave and a shrine. A grave is a location of remains. A shrine is a location of meaning. The Arizona is transitioning from the former to the latter. Even when the steel is gone, the coordinates will remain. The white platform will still hover over the place where the world changed. The story of the Arizona is not really about the ship anymore. It is about the promise. It is about the promise made by a nation to never forget the cost of unpreparedness. It is about the promise made by the survivors to remember their friends. It is about the promise made by the divers who swim through the oil to check the hull sensors. As we stand on the memorial today, looking down at the rainbow sheen of the oil, we are witnessing a long, slow goodbye. The ship is dying. She has been dying for 84 years. But in her decay, she is teaching us something about the permanence of sacrifice. The steel dissolves, but the watch stands. 40 feet down, in the crushing silence of the hull, the 900 men are still at their posts. They are in the engine rooms, the magazines, and the sleeping quarters. They are forever young, forever frozen in the moment before the alarm sounded. They are the eternal crew of a ship that will never dock. The sun sets over Pearl Harbor. The flag on the memorial is lowered for the day. The tourists leave, their cameras full of images of white concrete and blue water. The harbor grows quiet. But below the surface, the Arizona remains. She is broken, she is bleeding, and she is disappearing. Yet, she is still the most powerful ship in the American fleet, not because of her guns, but because of her gravity. She anchors us to our history. She holds the line against forgetting. And as long as we keep telling the story, as long as we keep measuring the oil and guarding the hull, the Arizona will never truly sink. She sails on in the memory of a nation, a ghost ship that guides the way forward by showing us exactly where we have been.